Hi, everyone. My name's Francis Hwang. This is my talk, Conversations versus Laws. What do we mean when we say Ruby is dynamic? I was going to preface this with one disclaimer that said that this is going to be a very low-code talk, but we've actually had a lot of those so far. And actually, there have been talks so far with less code than mine, which I was kind of impressed by. This talk is meant to be fairly provocative. It's meant to have lots of completely random ideas from other domains that could maybe provoke thinking. You're not expected to agree with all of it. And let me put in a preemptive disclaimer. If I forget to say it when we get to this part, I am not comparing Java programmers to slaveholders. You'll know what I mean. Sorry, what? More? How's this? Okay. So we say Ruby is a dynamic language. We say it's a dynamic language community. And what do we mean by that, right? There's language features. There's things that are written into the Ruby interpreter, the actual tool. There's duck typing and method missing and open classes. And if you're here at RubyConf, you probably know and love all of that stuff. I wanted to talk more about broader ideas, particularly the ideas that are in our heads that are in currency within the community, either sort of implicit or explicit, ideas we might be able to draw from news sources to sort of inform how our community keeps moving forward. So philosophy, politics, biology. So these are kind of things we're going to be talking about. The talk is organized basically into a couple of very big, sort of emblematic, mini manifesto sort of statements. First one is this: there are no types, so love your classes. What does that mean? So here's some arbitrary definitions only for the sake of discussion. Not that these definitions are fixed or universal. They're not. But type is abstract and class is concrete. This is a distinction you see a lot in a dynamic language community. You don't see it as much in a static language community, right? The class is the concrete thing. You open up IRB, you create a string. It's a instance of the string class. You know the string class is real because it was written in C or in whatever else. In JRuby, it's written in Java, or who knows what. And that's an embodied thing. It's as real as anything in code is, right? And then the type is sort of this more abstract thing. It's not even the thing you're manipulating in Ruby code, right? It's sort of this abstract, semi-mathematical concept, right? And it's not something you can actually put your hands on. In static languages, there are a lot of practitioners. Java is the obvious big example. There are many practitioners who believe that types are real, not just strings, but users, companies, contracts, all of these things that you might embody somehow in your code. Types are real, and when you do a lot of good domain analysis, you discover types. And then your classes should match as closely as possible to your types. In Ruby, we don't really believe that, right? And the clearest sign that this is the case is the fact that the type method is deprecated. One day we'll be rid of it, right? Because in Ruby we say when you have an object, you know what its class is. That's not a big deal. But what's its type? And we kind of just say, well, you know what? We just punt on that question. Your code really can't tell you. Maybe it doesn't exist. So this RubyConf, we have 2 people with slides about Plato. What are the odds? This stuff starts with Plato. There's lots of other places throughout philosophy and philosophical history that these kinds of ideas take form and take root, but Plato is sort of where it starts. Platonic idealism, particularly, is the term for this concept. Plato believed that there were the things in the physical world that you were looking at. So if you have trees, right? You have this kind of gnarled tree on the left, you have this palm tree, and then you have this more of a deciduous, I don't even know the terms. And there is an abstract concept behind all of them. All 3 of those trees that were photographs taken of actual trees in the real world are backed by this thing, this abstract tree concept. That tree isn't physical. You can't put your hands on it. You can't cut it down. You can't water it or whatever. But it's as real as those physical trees in front of you. And in fact, maybe it's even more real, right? Plato talked about sort of the allegory of the cave, which deals with this a lot. And there's been a lot of history of people who want to think this way. The Gnostics thought this way. Pretty much Christianity and Islam and a lot of different world religions have very strong strains of thinking in this direction. And whenever you talk about type systems in the real world, the biggest example you hit is, in fact, from biology. It's the Systema Naturae by Carl Linnaeus, who was sort of the father of biological taxonomy. So starting in the 18th century, he laid out a series of books. This is the cover of the 10th edition, in which he pretty much organizes every living thing known to man in a bunch of different categories. And the astounding thing about his work is that this more or less sticks. We are 250 years later, and biologists still more or less use the system he laid out. There was a ton of stuff we didn't know yet about life, but at the same time put it down and we're more or less using it. Now, it turns out that the biggest reason there are these sort of sensible type clusterings in biology is because of evolution, right? Things descend from other things in a genetic sense. DNA makes us similar to other things. So, Darwin wouldn't write Origin of the Species for another 50 years, but you can sort of say once Linnaeus had laid down the system, Darwin's work was just over the corner, just over the horizon. This is Homo sapiens. This is us, right? So starting from the upper left-hand corner is the most generic or most universal. We're the eukaryotic domain. We're cells with a nucleus. Then the Animalia kingdom with eukaryotic cells and multicellular, blah, blah, blah. You go down, you order primates, so we have collarbones, eyes facing forward, and grasping hands, all the way down to Homo sapiens, which is RubyConf attendees and other people. Now, the fact that we are part of the primates order means that in a typological sense, in a taxonomic sense, we're related to monkeys, baboons, right, mandrills. And again, as I said, the truth behind this is because we probably did all come millions and millions of years ago from similar ancestors. But even in this type system, there are holes. If you look closely enough, and species is where you have to look. Scientifically speaking, species is the most testable of all these different categorizations. A lot of them are open to interpretation. Right? What does it mean to say your eyes are facing forward? Like how, right? Like where's the line? The definition of species is that two different organisms are in the same species if they can interbreed, and if they can't interbreed, they're not in the same species. So that's pretty clean. That's sensible, right? There's an edge case. They're called ring species. There's only a couple of them discovered on the planet, but this is one of them. They're Laris gulls. This is a grouping of gulls that live around the North Pole. This map on the right has the North Pole at the center. North America is on the left-hand side, and the Eurasian continent is on the right. These Laris gulls, and you can sort of see these names and these arrows, they can interbreed with their neighbors, but they can't all interbreed with one another. So you can't say they're all the same species, because they can't all interbreed with one another. But you can't say they're all separate species either, because some of them can interbreed with some of the other ones. So even in something as stable as a species definition, types don't really work. And it gets messier as soon as you get into all kinds of real stuff. I think there's a strong case to be made for the fact that when computing first started out, it first started having effect on society, the things that you modeled were the most concrete. You were modeling accounting, right? You were modeling scientific applications and lots of statistical measurements of things that you took in the field. And as we start modeling more and more things, we have to get a better sense of, like, what is modelable, right? If I'm writing a Facebook clone, how am I going to model friendship, right? Is that fuzzy or not fuzzy? So we'll talk about race. Race is kind of a red herring. It's an easy one, right? Because there's a lot of bad antecedents. This is the curse of Ham. It's Genesis chapter 9, verses 25 through 27. This text is from the King James edition. The context of this is Ham is a son of Noah, and this takes place after the flood. He walks in on his father and sees him naked, which is not okay in the Old Testament world. So Noah curses not his own son, Ham, but his own grandson, Canaan. And he'll be a servant of servants, shall he be unto his brethren. The reason I bring this up is because actually over the course of centuries, this curse became, for some reason, associated with Africans. And then in the United States, when we had slavery running for a good couple of centuries, there were a lot of people in the South who, in a lot of ways are perfectly sensible, thinking, trying to be moral people, but they were surrounded by the system, and a lot of them took part in it. And they always had these questions. Why is it okay to enslave these people? Right? And there were lots of different reasons. There were pseudoscientific reasons that Africans were different. They thought differently. They didn't experience pain as intensely. And there was theological reasons like this. Right? So this is where the disclaimer comes in. Because Java programmers are not slaveholders. But if we can imagine software, object-oriented code being written in a slave-holding society, is it too much of a stretch to imagine a type system that's pretty much like this? Homo sapiens are at the top. They have two descendant subclasses, Europeans and Africans, right? Because you can ask all these questions about policy, and the first thing you ask, are they a European or are they an African? Do they get to read? Do they get to own property? Do they get to intermarry how they like? Are they property themselves? The only question you ask, are they Europeans or are they Africans? And you can also maybe make the case that in a taxonomic sense, the drive for abolition was basically equivalent of simplifying this diagram. You're saying, well, we have these observable facts we know. These people have pinkish skin, and these people have blackish skin, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that you should treat them any differently. And incidentally, I bring in the cursive hand, but this is not a Christian versus atheist thing or a Christian versus non-Christian thing, because of course we know historically plenty of abolitionists were Christians. So, race is not something that we believe necessarily. Today, it's not that prevalent to believe that race has a very deep, profound sense of being. A lot of people are willing to believe that there's a lot of social mitigating factors in it, but it still shows up. Are these people Native Americans? Wired magazine did a story, I think last year, about, and they featured these 4 people and a bunch of other people who are seeking membership in tribes in Native America, and they're usually subjected to DNA testing, and this is a fairly contested point. I believe the man in the center left, his great-great-great-grandfather was a chief of some tribe way back. I believe the woman in the center right actually belongs to a a grouping of African slaves who, shortly after being freed from slavery in the aftermath of the Civil War, were essentially adopted. Not biologically connected, but adopted socially by a Native American tribe. And today they are subjected to DNA testing. So it's a tricky thing, right? These people, they apply for membership, and they say, it's an emotional issue for me. My dad said it was really important, and I promised I would take care of this for him. And a lot of them say part of the problem is because of casino gambling, some Native American tribes have a lot more money than they used to, and they distribute this money throughout the tribe. So your membership might mean you might get some of that. So what? Are some of these people lying? They could be. But the broader question is really, does anything that matters have a fixed definition, right? Which is ultimately, are types real? And it's my opinion that the answer is no. That in a time of tremendous social change, and in a time of tremendous diversity, and all of these different things happening, any word that you could care about is being contested right now. Is this marriage? These are 2 men in San Francisco, right, during the time period where the San Francisco City Hall decided to reinterpret the California state marriage law, and a bunch of people had same-sex marriages. Is this a marriage? What do you think about that? Is this human life? This is Terri Schiavo on a hospital bed in a persistent vegetative state for years, right? And we know, of course, there was a huge controversy of whether or not it was okay to remove her feeding. And in a time when definitions are changing, do we cling to them or do we let them go? One of the interesting aftermaths of the Terri Schiavo controversy, actually, is a lot of estate lawyers said, anecdotally, that they believed that the case and the fact that it was in the news led a lot of people to have conversations with their relatives and their loved ones about these kinds of situations, right? So instead of being part of the side of the debate that says, I'm going to have this definition of life and I'm going to write it on a sign and I'm going to stand on the street and I'm going to shout at people all day long, instead what they did the quiet thing. They sat down with their friends and their relatives and said, I don't even really know what life is. But if this happens to me in this circumstance, I'd like you guys to do this. Right? So it's not about what definitions are, right? It's all about admitting the ultimate difficulty of having these fixed things and trying to work through them anyway. Okay, so let's bring it back to Java and Ruby. This is Elliot Rusty Harold posting on a blog. He's a Java programmer, and it's probably a little unfair to make fun of him while he's not here, but I'm going to do it anyway. In 2005, some of you will remember that in the Ruby and Java blogging world, there was this big kind of brouhaha about the design of the array class, right? Is the array class any good, right? And there was a lot of people on the Java side who were saying it does too much. And this is excerpted from Elliot Rusty Harold's blog post on the subject, and he kind of goes through every single thing in the array API, and he says, look at all this crap it does, right? Is it a list? Is it a stack? Is it a map? now it's turned into a queue, now it's a matrix. What the hell? Why does it all have to be the same thing, right? Because for some practitioners of static typing, type is meaningful, right? You say, okay, and actually class is meaningful because class and type are the same thing. So you say, oh, this is an array list, or this or that, it's a map, it's a set, it's blah, blah, blah. And that is, you pass that in, and someone else who maybe, maybe it's yourself, actually, writing another method or whatever, looks at the type before they look at anything else. And they say, okay, this is this type, and I have to treat it this way, right? So that's kind of a particular, maybe a caricature of a Java response to how Ruby does a lot of its languages. Rubyists don't believe in type, right? And we think class mostly is an implementation detail. Class is how'd you write the thing? How does it work? That's all, right? So the Java response is this type doesn't mean anything. It's like too many things at once. And the Ruby response is, dude, it's your own array, right? Aren't you supposed to know what you do with it? I think, and I think it's important to note that a lot of dynamic language stuff, as dynamic languages sort of come back into the mainstream, as they get accepted by more and more programmers, it goes hand in hand with sort of XP and Agile methodologies. This is a chronology of this. I don't think this chronology is accidental, right? Extreme Programming Explained came out in 1999. The Programming Ruby, the Pickaxe, came out in 2001. Dave Thomas and Andrew Hunt are signatories to the Agile Manifesto. They were right in it, right? And of course, then the Rails book comes out in 2005, and here we are. Because what happened is a bunch of people, many of them who were doing Java, started writing all these unit tests, right? And they were realizing, we can't statically analyze the correctness of our code. We can only kind of simulate circumstances and see how it behaves, right? We care less about the type. We care less about its mathematical properties, because that's really hard to do right. And we care a lot more about, I'm going to set it up this way, then this way, then this way, then I call this method, and I should get this result. And once you started doing that, and I actually went through this process personally, then you're like, well, I don't need static typing at all. All static typing does, for me, is proves that I know how to satisfy a compiler, but that's not my job. Step 2. People are more real than contracts, so keep talking. This is sort of a corollary of the first one. I'm going to start with 2 examples on 2 extremes of this continuum. Number 1. This is the legal definition of buttocks in the county of St. John's, Florida. It was passed in March 1992 by its Board of Commissioners. It's about 300 words long. And maybe you can't read it in the back, but it's a doozy. It's got all the stuff about the hamstring muscle, below the gluteal fold, and the lowest point of the curvature of the fleshy protuberance. And it's really something. By the way, this is in Harper's Magazine. If you don't know about Harper's, you should be reading it. It's the oldest monthly magazine in America, and it's phenomenal. How did they get to this point? Well, they got to this point because they were trying to pass a law about what you could wear to the beach, right? And then, well, can you wear a thong? And how much of your buttocks can be exposed? And then someone started talking about, well, what are your buttocks anyway? So then I guess they went to the library. So let's imagine how this law gets enforced, right? Can you imagine being a police officer on the beach in St. Johns County, Florida? You got to carry around a big card with this whole thing written down. Maybe on the other side you've got a diagram. Because you got all these like semicircles and divided lines. Then anytime you give someone a ticket, you have to take photos, because if it gets contested in court, like, you're going to be, well, look at how much of it was the diagram and the bisected lines. So that's the extreme on one end. This is a slide representing the extreme on the other end. This woman's name is Louise Thompson. She's a justice coordinator at the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne. Akwesasne is a Native American tribe, I believe, in Canada. And they practice what a lot of Native American tribes practice, a form of justice called restorative justice. It's a pretty remarkable thing. But basically what they do is, in most of their cases, they don't have static laws that are written down. Instead, they pretty much have a big meeting. They say, okay, this person did this bad thing, and as a community, we want to take care of what happened. So if you're the perpetrator, you've got to show up. And if you're the victim, you should show up. And anyone who feels affected should just show up. And so a woman like Louise Thompson, her job is not to be a judge, right? She doesn't interpret laws. Her job is to mediate a discussion between different members of the community. So you might have a situation where some guy does some vandalism, right? He just gets drunk, and then he goes and breaks a bunch of windows, and then he gets arrested and sort of has to go to this process. And then the people who own the house say, well, I mean, my windows are broken, so that sucks, and also I feel less safe than I do, and that also sucks. And the guy has to, by the way, you can't do it if you don't genuinely express remorse. If you have to admit that you did it and believe and actually be sorry. Okay, so other than that, yeah. So then the guy comes and stuff, but then sometimes really fascinating things happen. Sometimes the guy's friend shows up, and he says, actually, he's not such a bad guy. He did a terrible thing, but he's been going through a really bad year. He's become an alcoholic, he's my friend, and I want to help him out. So if we can get something going, I would totally be willing to sign on the dotted line and say he's going to go to Alcoholics Anonymous, right? You can say a lot of things about how this might not scale. There's possibilities of bias in different places. But there's a lot of studies that say that in certain circumstances, these are tremendously effective practices. They're done in Native American groups in the United States and Canada. They also get done a lot in war-torn regions. Very similar practices were done in South Africa after apartheid to sort of get over everything. And the reason I bring it up is because there aren't rules written down, right? Like a guy breaks a bunch of windows, and in a traditional justice system, he goes to a court. There's two lawyers he's never met. There's a judge he's never met. And the judge is interpreting a law that was written by a bunch of legislators he never met. Right? Whereas in this sort of a system, there is actually a social ethic. It's just not put anywhere on paper. It's worked out case by case. Ruby is a low-contract environment, sort of socially and technically speaking. Right? We don't have a spec in a written form. You can't buy a book called the Ruby Spec that's like 600 pages long and lays out all the mathematical aspects of how array should act and string should act and file systems and so on and so forth, right? And that's maybe it's because Matt just didn't want to do that, and because that's not really fun, But I think it's also on a more profound level. It's because we as a community believe that's okay, right? We want some kind of a spec as people are sort of like going forward with Rubinius and JRuby and IronRuby and so on and so forth. But maybe we'll work that out through tests. Right, which is a different sort of thing. It also doesn't have any library namespace mechanism, which is to say, there isn't really any formal way for people to release a bunch of gens and not have name collisions. And by the way, does anybody know who was the first person in the Ruby community to release a library that was named the same as somebody else's library? Anyone? You. Yes, thank you. It was me. A couple years ago, totally by accident, I released a library called File System, which later became MockFS. And it used to be called, there was someone else who had released a library called File System, I just didn't know. And I hadn't checked carefully enough. And I changed it, right? Now, I didn't change it because there was any law written down. I changed it because, A, I'm a nice guy, honest. But even if I wasn't a nice guy, I want you guys to think I'm cool, right? And if I release a library called File System and be like, well, you should change your name because my library is totally better and it's a better name for me than for you, then everyone's going to be like, Francis Hwang's kind of an asshole. Which is a lot more powerful than any sort of written rule, right? Like that actually is what matters. Java, in contrast, and now to be fair, different languages perform in different environments, socially speaking, right? But Java has a pretty strict namespacing mechanism, which is when you release a library that other people use, you have to take your domain name and turn it backwards, right? Because domain names are unique. So, okay, well, Java gets top level because it's Java, sure. So if I was writing a thing with Java I/O stuff, I'd import Java I/O, and then I'm going to do some QuickTime Apple things, so I'd com.apple.quicktime.v2, and maybe then I'm going to do something with Halo, I don't know, something with Halo, so if Bungie releases a Java Halo library, I don't know, import com.bungie.halo3. That sounds kind of fun, actually. But even here, edge cases, right? GNU doesn't honor this system. The Free Software Foundation doesn't want to do it. They don't do org.gnu. They just do GNU, right? And if you want to know why, you can go to their website. And they basically just say, come on, we're GNU. That's all. They didn't ask Sun's permission. They just did it. And what's Sun going to do? They can't sue them or anything. It's just kind of there, and it's this weird thing, and everyone's like, well, I guess, you wrote the first Emacs, so I guess you get to do that? I don't know. By the way, am I the only one who thinks the cartoon is kind of creepy? It's kind of, Can they modernize it or hold a contest? The web's a messy place, right? And so the thing that's been interesting is that I do think on a psychological level, the rise of dynamic languages works extremely well with the fact that the web is part of our lives now. It's part of our jobs in a lot of ways. A lot of us are programming websites. That's the obvious way. But even if you're not, you're interacting with code from all these different directions now, right? Most everybody is using some kind of open source code and a thing, even if you're actually writing just like build scripts for a semiconductor company or something, right? And the web's a messy place. So you set up a web, like user data is messy, right? You set up a website, and people create like 4 user accounts because they keep forgetting their email address. Then someone says they want anonymous comments, and then, okay, whatever, 5% to 95% of your comments are spam about Viagra, right? And that's the web. That's all. You don't get anything else. You don't get the structure. You don't get dependency. You don't get integrity of data. It's just it's a goddamn mess, and that's the way it is. But even someone else's library or framework, right? Like if I go to RubyForge and I'm looking for a library that does a specific thing, then I search in RubyForge, right? Then I get something, and it's just, oh yeah, this guy's got this library. I'm not going to like download it and use it and put it into production in a day. You have to sort of vet it, right? You have to look, and even just these little hints, like, do I know the person who wrote it? Have they released any code? Have they released any code in the last 2 years? Right? Do I know anyone who's using it? Can I go into any kind of local user groups and say, hey, is anyone using this library? What do you think? Is it good? Because people put out, even in Ruby, yes, people put out a lot of crap libraries. Some of you have put out crap libraries. So you have to sort of defend yourself, right? There isn't any central authority that can say these libraries are good, these libraries aren't. I mean, there's people whose opinion you trust, but there isn't a formal technical structure. And external APIs and tools have a similar kind of problem, right? If you're ever using, if you ever end up, web programmers might know what I'm talking about. If you have to use JavaScript from a third party that you include on your own site, like ad including software or analytics software, you have to make really goddamn certain they don't mess up your page. Because some people write some terrible JavaScript, and of course, you know, the JavaScript environment is not, there's no protection at all, right? And yeah, that's not, you can't just be like, oh, you read the document, and they say it's clean. They say it won't do anything, and you just put it out. No, you have to check for yourself, right? And when the documents and the tools are out of sync, that's not an exception. That's not like a once-in-a-lifetime occurrence. That's the norm, right? The norm is the code works the way it works, and hopefully the document is good, hopefully. Hopefully you have a good enough relationship with this other group that they'll listen to you, that they'll make changes when you need them to make changes, or tell you how it's working, or so on and so forth. RSS feeds, same thing. Or any kind of external, you know, web servicey sort of thing, shit just goes down, right? If you're not running it, you can't guarantee that it's up. So there's actually a really interesting essay that I kind of feel like bringing in here. It's a bit tangential, but it's by this guy Jaron Lanier, who is actually the inventor of the concept of virtual reality. All right, yeah. Working on the telepresence project now, and he's written a bunch of really phenomenal essays. And one thing he wrote recently is sort of about the differences between traditional computer science and robotics. Well, it's actually about 1,000 things at once, but he starts by talking about how computer science is all about creating structured protocols. You've got an array, you've got a string, it can be sort of mathematically defined. And robotics now is really all about services. Or that's, you know, there's a lot of great work that's happening where it's really just about matching patterns. This is a surface, right? This is a fake gecko adhesive. So there's a guy at Berkeley who's trying to make robots that can stick to walls in the way that geckos can stick to walls. But the point that Jaron Lanier makes is when you de-emphasize protocols and pay attention to patterns on surfaces, you enter into a world of approximation rather than perfection. With protocols, you tend to be drawn into all-or-nothing high-wire acts of perfect adherence in at least some aspects of your design. Pattern recognition, in contrast, assumes the constant minor presence of errors and doesn't mind them. That's, you know, that. And then, by the way, anytime anyone at a tech conference says ecosystem, that's what they mean. It means you've got a big thing going on, it's pretty good, but like some of it just doesn't work. That's a lot of it, right? And everyone is kind of working out their role in an ecosystem and trying to figure out, is this library any good? Am I going to use it? Am I going to talk to that guy? Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing about nature is nature can be fooled, right? So you're kind of making this funny trade-off. This is an owl butterfly. named because of the spot. And a lot of biologists believe that it has that spot because it can fend off because birds will see it and get scared, and it'll give it an extra couple of seconds to fly away and not be eaten. Right? So nature has its downsides too, but we know that natural systems, ecosystems, and so on and so forth, real ecosystems are tremendously resilient. All kinds of disasters can happen, and life continues. This is my third point. Life is risk, so seek it out. This is India. And if you work in our business, you know a lot about India, probably. Some of you may be so young and so green that you don't have memories of what it was like, what the business was like before India got involved. But probably a lot of us know more or less what the industry in the U.S. went through, say in like roughly the last 10 years, and the fear that was involved. And that's that. I kind of take Chad Fowler's position, which is that overall it's a great thing that India is part of the global marketplace, our marketplace, and that basically you're dealing with a bunch of people who happen to have been born on the other side of the planet, who are more or less just as smart and just as ambitious and just as hardworking, and just as conscientious as us. But there's no question that their presence in the field, maybe we had it a little cushier for in the short term. I think overall it's good for everyone, and overall it's good for us. But there's a wage pressure. Let's not be. And it's not just India, right? There's plenty of countries that are getting in on the global software business, on our business, on a business that used to be basically the United States and Europe and Japan, parts of East Asia. If you ever want a reminder of the wage pressures involved, you can go to getafreelancer.com. I don't know if you've ever seen this site, but people bid for jobs and other people, right? And it's actually like this kind of low-rent hub of the international freelancer market. This person wants an OS Commerce modification. OS Commerce is a really crappy PHP e-commerce thing, right? But a lot of people use it. And they want modifications. They're saying tasks already identified are for 7 hours development. You scroll down, there are 10 bids. The average bid is $77. Who here wants to write PHP code for $11 an hour? Raise your hand. Come on. Come on. Yeah. All right. I'll get your card later. Now, we can say all these things to ourselves about how, it's PHP, it's not Rails, or Ruby, or whatever. These, whatever, OS Commerce is crap. They'll never catch up to us. But, people have said that before. And you've got to always kind of be on your toes about this stuff. And the question more fundamentally is, given where you are, given the kind of work you do, and given the country you live in, given your cost of living, what is there that you should be doing? And I do actually believe that this ties a lot to sort of the dynamic mindset, right? Because the first thing is, when did this talk start? It started at 4 p.m. in Charlotte and 1:30 a.m. in Bangalore, right? Now, just by coincidence, I got this Flickr slide this week. This sculpture is actually right in front of the hotel. It's pretty cool. And 1:30 a.m. in Bangalore. So between the East Coast and Bangalore, you're dealing with a 9.5-hour difference. And if anyone has ever worked on any of these radically decentralized kind of projects with time pressure. So I'm not talking about some fancy open source thing where this guy is in Iceland and that person's in Tokyo or whatever, because sometimes you can just sort of things can move slowly. But if you're working on one of these projects 40 hours a week, right, there's only certain points in the day you can actually have phone calls, right? Thanks to Skype and all that stuff, these phone calls are free or whatever, but it's actually extremely hard to make decisions, right? So part of the question is fundamentally, where is it in the business that they need to make decisions quickly, that they need to make decisions more than once a day, right? Because the way I'm relating this is basically, I think that this dynamic mindset really sets you up for, we'll just change the structure of this program 4 times today. I don't mind. It's my job and I love it, and it's a really interesting challenge, and so on and so forth, right? So, if you are at a company that says these sorts of things, you are probably not in a company that can make decisions quickly. You're right, but this was decided months ago and can't be changed now. Let's just get this contract finished. We can fix the problems as part of maintenance. It's going to be more effective to let our customers complain about it. And so what you're talking about as a company, its feedback loops are not good, right? Some companies make decisions very slowly. And to be fair, there are sometimes reasons, right? Very good reasons. You're designing a pacemaker. I don't know if agile methodologies are that good for you if someone could die, right? But, I think if you want to be in a dynamic kind of mindset in your craft, I think it makes sense to put yourself near people who need to make decisions all the time. And to be clear, this is not just a small company, big company thing, right? There are big companies that can make decisions extremely quickly. This is a picture of a Toyota plant in the United States. I don't know how many of you have sort of read up about their own production methods, their own design methods, but Toyota practices a method called Kaizen. Toyota, incidentally, this year will be the biggest car company in the world. And they practice a production method called Kaizen, in which factory workers are allowed to stop the line if they think defective products are going out. So you get, and for this to be done effectively, it's extremely hard, right? You need to have the people at the very top say, yeah, you won't be punished for this. I'm not just going to see it on some dashboard and yell at somebody because your output is less. Because we know that that's the bottom line. The bottom line is quality. And you could just be some factory worker in Alabama with just a high school education, and I'm going to trust your judgment. So little decisions get made at Toyota plants every single day, often by people with not an extremely high degree of education. And that is, I think the epitome of a very healthy decision-making environment. The second point is kind of this question of like, what company are you in, what industry are you in, and what sort of quality do they need, right? And I think it's very easy for people like us, because we all believe we're pretty good programmers, to say, you know what, you pay me this much money an hour, maybe I charge a little more than a PHP person, and you're still going to get, like, per dollar spent, you're going to get this much code. But I think a lot of business kind of prerogatives don't let you just think in terms of this very simple scenario, right? It's actually a lot about managing risk. So here's what I mean. This is a very fanciful chart of here's a team ability, and then here's your results, right? So if your programming team ability is all the way over here, if you're the best goddamn hackers in the world, maybe you'll be the next Google. If you're all the way on the other end, you'll never work in this valley again. In the middle, it's bought by Yahoo, which is pretty good. Not as good as being the next Google, but pretty good. And then satisfied customers, which is probably where lots of us get to be. Now, I think a lot of people, if you're the kind of person who's going to take the weekend out, go down to Charlotte and hang out at RubyConf, you probably all want to be all the way on the right side. And I would say probably a lot of us are getting there, or we're along the right path. And that's a great thing, right? But a lot of companies don't care that much about that. Because, and they'd rather actually, if they can, narrow it. Keep in mind, most people who are hiring you don't know how good you are or how bad you are. They kind of just know these buzzwords. Now, if you have a boss who is either another programmer, you're doing okay. If you have a boss who's used to be a programmer and knows just enough about it to know what's going on, you're doing okay. But ultimately, in a lot of companies, the person who makes the decision, the person who assigns payroll and hiring practices is not a programmer. And in some companies, so there's always for them some sort of risk. I'm hiring this person. He comes in, he talks a good game, and he was working at this last company that's sort of impressive. But so I'm going to kind of roll the dice, right? Like, he should be good, but I can't really be certain. So a lot of companies would rather have a chart that looks like this, right? They'll never be the next Google, but they don't care. That's not their problem. And they'll never have a catastrophe. Or maybe, like, if this part is catastrophe, then they'll have a small chance of it, right? This is, in business, the phrase core competency is really a lot about this, right? If you're a startup, you have to, as Paul Graham says, you have to really go for that technical excellence, because if you're a .com startup, right? But if you're a hospital and you want to hire someone to do your billing system, I've never worked at a hospital, so maybe that's not the best example, but I hope it's decent. Maybe getting a hotshot is really not, maybe you just rather, because you're really more worried about delivering healthcare, right? You want them to hang around. Yeah, right. So I think, every different corporation, every different organization, and every different industry prioritizes different things. And it's not just we'll spend more money on this thing than we will on this thing. It's more we will manage the risks more in this thing than we do this thing in this thing, right? Think about finance, right? Those of you who are interested in finance, almost all of finance is people paying each other to take on or to remove risk, right? If I buy an option from you, I'm giving you money right now, and you're owning risk, right? That might actually mean it's a bad deal for you or for me or whatever. It's all about sliding risk around. This is the exact same thing. Some companies don't want high-risk technology situations. So if you imagine, and this is totally unprovable, I don't know, but I think there's still a lot of management that believes the range of quality among Java teams is maybe here, so it's narrower, right? And the range of quality of Ruby team is there, but it's wider. And is it possible to hire a totally crap Ruby team that will destroy your company? Absolutely, right? So what kind of company are you? Do you need the absolute best technology or not? And to invert the question, if you're a programmer who wants to have a very dynamic mindset, right, and to write the best code, where are you? What kind of company are you in? What kind of industry are you in? Do they really need you to be as good as you want to be? This is my fourth point. It's more of a closing point than anything else. Things fall apart. These are Tibetan Buddhist monks making a... I'm totally blanking on the name for this thing they're making. Mandala? Thank you. Yeah, right. Yes. I think they're actually making it at a train station in Kansas City. Right? These are made out of sand. These are highly intricate colored paintings of a bodhisattva, which is, I think, sort of like an imaginary realm or something. I actually not really up on my Tibetan Buddhism. But it takes days to make this thing. They make it by hand, out of hand, right, with the knowledge that it will be destroyed at the end. And in fact, I read the news story that's attached to this. Apparently in the middle of this, some 2-year-old kid walked by and got really excited because colors, right, and ran in there and jumped all over it. It was like, woo, sand! And then the mom grabbed him and ran off because she was terrified. And then the monks just laughed, right, because the impermanence of it is part of it. Doing it for 4 days and getting down there and putting every little grain in the right place and knowing that eventually it'll be swept away, that's part of the practice. Now, we can sort of say, well, that's all good and nice, but we're not monks and blah, blah, blah. But, but everyone has, this should not be such a unfamiliar experience. If you've ever built a sandcastle, it's the same thing in a probably more constrained, modest sort of way, right? Your sandcastle's not going to last forever anyway. And I'm bringing this up as sort of a closing point because I think that impermanence is sort of this theme that runs through everything I've been talking about, right? Your code definitions that you've depended on don't last. Your code doesn't last. Your career won't last forever, right? So it's natural, it's probably innate to our DNA to want to grasp onto things, to hold things that are permanent, right? And I think a lot of things are effectively permanent for now, right? You write code, you define these classes, you push them out into the world, and all this stuff happens, and money gets made, and people, use it, and so on and so forth, and that's permanent, but it's not permanent. It's not actually permanent, right? It's permanent until it changes, permanent until your code isn't needed anymore, it gets replaced, until Ruby becomes lame, and in 10 years we're all doing Erlang on Rails or whatever, like this. And fundamentally, the kind of the thing I'm trying to talk about is really on a really profound level, everything you do is shifting away, right? You can hold on to it and hold on to it for as long as it's useful, and then when it's not useful, let it go, right? Because none of our work is going to last, but that doesn't mean it's not worth doing. You just have to sort of know the right mindset to do it. That's my talk. Thank you for listening. Any questions or just comments, please? Anyone? Questions? Yes, sir.
Well, I had a comment. You're sitting through your discourse on race and thinking about one of the biologists who discovered the whole biological code being fired because he said that Africans were inferior to Europeans, and this was like
James
a
Watson.
couple of weeks ago.
Really recently, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. Just because you're good at science doesn't mean you're good at everything. I don't know. Yeah.
This is a biologist. This is the guy who invented the gene.
And when he was in his 20s, he was brilliant. And when he's in his 80s, he can lose it a bit.
Yeah, he had a whole life full of racism. That happens to scientists.
It wasn't the first incident, by the way. That was a recurring problem.
Other questions or comments? Yes?
Just some I'm Ricky Natali. I write the blog Talk Like a Duck.
Oh, hi.
I feel like I found a kindred spirit,
Oh,
particularly when it comes to the review of types. Just a few added comments and things to look at for people who are interested in this. Your evolution driving the taxonomy. Interesting article by Stephen Jay Gould, of all people, called What If Anything is a Zebra? Turns out there's 3 types of zebras in the world, but if you look at them, one of them is not related to the others. So there's this notion of types as sort of a filter of how we look at things. I mean, we tend to think of zebras as horse-like things, like with stripes, right? But that's a superficial type.
So you're saying one of them is not related in terms of it has to go way up.
Right, so you have to go way up to find any kind of common answer.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Another very interesting book is Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things by George Lakoff, who has recently become more famous as a political figure, but it talks. He's a linguist, a cultural linguist, I guess, and it goes into all kinds of examination of things, particularly in languages, where people tend to agree that there are categories like trees, in your example, right? But if you look around the world, you'll find that they don't always put the same things in the same categories.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? So we tend to partition the categories at that level, but building hierarchies is completely different.
When you look closely, it turns out, and this happens all the time in business, right? Like they say, oh yeah, we want blog posts on these videos or whatever, and then you're like, yeah, sure, I know what a blog is. And if you don't ask, then like 6 weeks later, they're like, hey, that's not.
Look at languages, things that a lot of people will know about. Different languages categorize different nouns into genders or don't. Japanese has different numbering series for counting different kinds of categories of objects. We have no perception.
Korean does that too, and
right?
It's impossible.
Yeah, so.
Yes.
I'm just curious, in computing history, there was a big fight between Fortran and BASIC. And for a long while, the compiler languages looked down on anybody who did BASIC. I mean, they were like subhuman. And I sort of really wonder what were the dynamics that changed, and now that there's research in interactive interpretive language.
Yeah, I mean that's what you can conjecture about it all day. I would say.
I was there.
Well, can you repeat the question?
He was saying that sort of the back in the days of BASIC and Fortran, sort of there were basically the people who didn't want more kind of strong statically typed languages were kind of those were very severe minority, right? So are there forces that have changed? Probably. I mean, my very quick guess would be number one, computers are faster, so they're much better at parsing stuff, right? Which is great. And I think kind of hand in hand with that, as computers have become more a part of society, the actual makeup of people who make up computer programmers is changing, And because I think it's definitely the case. Like, I meet a lot of computer programmers who are older than me, and I'm like, oh yeah, you did assembly or Fortran or C or whatever. I've done a little bit of C at the very beginning of my career. I could never have done it for a lifetime. I could never have done it for a decade. I don't have it in me, And I definitely think. Because the industry, the field changes so quickly, we get in this situation where we get to look at the previous generation, and in some ways the problems, and certainly we owe a tremendous amount to the previous generation, but in some ways the problems they had to solve were totally different from what we have to solve in our day-to-day. So I think there's a lot of that as well.
I guess getting into that a little bit is I really enjoyed your presentation. It was very refreshing in the day. And the point you made about one of the concrete things you said was that the Java engineers' reaction to the Ruby array type class, what we call it, and it does too much. What is it? And I think I understand where they're coming from. And I think part of it is because the Ruby array does all that stuff, it indexes and makes it all very easy to do this. The underlying implementation is almost constrained to be a certain type of thing if you want to do it efficiently. I can make, if it was just a queue, I can do very efficient queues with doubly linked lists. But I can't make an efficient a Ruby array type that way. So that's, I think, where they're coming from to some degree, is the best I can justify it. If they look at the array type and they go, yeah, but what's that? It's constraining what can go under the covers. If I want to use it as a queue, I want to call it a queue, so I know I could use this implementation. If I want an array, I'll get an array.
No, I think that's a very good point. But I think in a general sense, right, like applications get less resource constrained as time goes on. I mean, it's a funny dance, right, because you get more resources and then you figure out how to burn them.
And that's me being an old fogey, an old curmudgeon, and I sense that, is that this generation, the younger programmers, as you point out, they never saw C, they've never banged on assembly, they have these incredibly fast tools for $1,000. And so they're coming away from dabbling with the technology and starting to grapple with more of the social issues. And that's a good application.
And personally, I was terrible with it. I almost failed that class. John.
Lisp has been around almost as long as, it's the second oldest language still in common use. So this line of reasoning is not quite ringing true for me, because you've always had the ability to write in a dynamically typed language, basically since 1960.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of.
But you couldn't do it on an expensive machine.
Hey, Josh. I'm sorry. What did Josh?
So I love kind of the post-structural take on things, especially since I think it's always amusing when you kind of have post-structuralism and computer programming collide. But are you familiar with kind of the origins of object-oriented programming and the intersection with Bertrand Russell's category theory?
I only they.
Basically, when they were inventing object-oriented programming, they said we need some way to model the real world, and they turned to philosophy and said, "Oh, hey, category theory. This is a good way to model reality." And so, a lot of the object-oriented inheritance and the class hierarchy you see comes directly out of that kind of Russell category theory. So, I know most people probably don't care about that, but it's.
No, yeah, there's a lot of.
There are actual
sort of how things got decided and what features got added. And I'm not arguing against classes, and I'm not really arguing against inheritance, though I actually think inheritance is a fairly dangerous tool. But yeah, like it's a very interesting question to ask. Sort of as more and more people start using object-oriented languages, what aspects of typing get dropped and added and retained, and so on and so forth. Yes.
I spend a lot of my time trying to teach Ruby to Java programmers. Somebody's got to do it. And it seems like some people, they just have no problem with it. They spent their whole career programming in Java, and they make the transition with minimal. So other people take a longer time, and then there's just a core of people that I cannot reach in any way. And I just wonder, and really this is, I don't know if you could answer this question or if anybody could, but I just wonder if there's some folks whose mode of thinking just precludes them from programming in these languages, because I've certainly sort of despaired at times.
Genetically predisposed?
Yeah. Well, no. The tricky thing about it is that, like, I think a lot of people, especially if they start out computing at a young age, I mean, there's the positive reasons you might start computing, and there are the negative reasons. Right? And the positive reasons are that you find it intellectually engaging, you like to build stuff, and maybe you're doing it with your friends, and so on and so forth. And there's also, of course, some negative reasons, which includes like sort of vague antisocial tendencies, or if you actually believe that Asperger's is like this huge thing in our career, which I don't know about, but and they all get mixed together. Most of us probably have both of them if we got into this career. I do think that there are a good number of people in our business who really like clean lines, who really find it comforting, and the thing is that classification is it's like a universal urge. Like people pretty much everywhere want to do it. So you can really make the case that there are basic sort of evolutionary reasons that we do it, or there used to be reasons to do it, and then arguably that some of us just have it stronger than others on an evolutionary level, on an emotional level. I
too. So eventually you'll just get down to this core sort of, no, it cannot work.
Right.
No, there's all this software out there that actually does work. No, it cannot possibly work.
And it's all about ultimately this question of like, do you need that in there, or are you comfortable? Sort of, it's like a letting go thing, right? Like I'm a bit of a Buddhist, if you can't tell, in a sort of amateurish way. And it's really just like you don't get to control that much, so just like learn how to deal,
question of this gentleman actually. Is there any relationship between the people who get into Ruby fast? Are they more into testing and that than the people who aren't?
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair statement. But the interesting thing is that it's not true that the people who don't like Ruby, but at least the ones that I've come across, it's not true that they're all bad programmers. And frequently, I can't predict. Somebody will come along, and I think, this guy's going to be no problem, and he just never gets it. And someone else will come along, and I'll think, yeah, this is going to be a problem, and they'll just do it like that. And so that's part of the puzzle that I can't figure it out.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts on statically typed languages that are less verbose than Java?
Yeah, I just don't like static typing, basically. I mean, obviously, less verbose than Java can't be a bad thing. But yeah, I think fundamentally the idea that type means something, I don't like it. Yeah, I don't want to, and I think that, and actually I could give a whole other talk about testing. I've been thinking about a lot this weekend. I think the idea of static, formally provable correctness is just wrong. Basically, that's kind of what Libre's getting at also. Saying, you have to sort of accept the imperfectness of your career and your life and your code and just move on, and that's that.
But isn't there an argument to be made for reducing the imperfection or making it more efficient?
But, well, I think it's really, what does static typing cost, right? And for me, it's hard for me to write tests because it's a little more typing. I mean, even if it was less than Java, it'll still be some, right? And it's hard for me to write code because there's totally times when I want to actually, in some weird, crazy, mocked-up way, I want to be like, well, it's expecting this user model logic, but I'm actually going to make an open struct right now, which, good Lord, that's a hack, but I have lots of tests in place, and maybe this won't ever see production, or at least I know I'm only doing this one case, so I'm fine. I don't actually think it gives you anything. Really, I don't think types are meaningful.
So strongly typed languages were once sold as being a cure-all for quality. I mean, I remember that being a big selling point. Have there been any studies that you know of that have debunked that at all? I mean, I can certainly see it in history of my own career. But
I think actually when you get down to studying sort of programming effectiveness in any sort of statistically valid way, you end up kind of with the same problem. It's a social science problem, right? This is the tricky thing about computers. It looks like math, but it's not. Right? It's a social phenomena. People come out of programming that are really good if they understood sometimes nonfiction writing, right? Sometimes if they understand history and philosophy, they're great programmers because of it. And so, anything you're like, well, it could be just this group of people or that group. There's all these there's all these weird things that could affect it. So I think it's a very difficult thing to study, and ultimately, it's like most else you do in life. You can't prove it one way or the other. Actually, Ryan.
I have an extended comment on that. I don't think there's been a single programming paradigm or computing phase where we haven't had a declaration of panacea or ultimateness. I mean, 640K of RAM is all we need, right? And object-oriented programming is supposed to be the end-all, be-all in code readers. I think they've all done it.
One thing I didn't really get to touch on, I just sort of hinted at it in that one slide, is that there is actually a lot of in Java, there's this sort of implicit understanding, I'll go back here. The reason I said team ability here versus just programmer, right, is because there's a lot of sort of implicit argument that because Java allows you to strongly type, you can configure your team differently, right? It's very common to get a couple of Java architects at the top. I mean, this is my understanding. I could be totally out of date. Who do a lot of the type definition for you, who do a lot of the diagram. I mean, I think every Java shop is going to be a little different, but that's something you could do in theory, right? Is kind of set out the types, and then
they make the contracts.
Exactly.
The interfaces.
Right. And without actually, they kind of hold the whole problem in their head, and they give you a diagram, and then the code monkeys are like, okay, I guess I got to make this work in Java, right? And then people talk about code generation, which I find really insulting, really. And that's definitely part of the dynamic, right? It's when you start talking to business people, it's insanely hard to hire programmers. We're temperamental and weird, and we're still expensive, and there's all these companies that are like, I don't know what's up with this guy. I don't understand what he does, but he could destroy my company if he wanted. right? So it's comforting for some people to hire a couple of people at the top who they think are smarter and they trust them more and stuff, and then at the bottom to have this sort of more like expendable, very junior sort of team. And a bad Java programmer does less damage than a bad Ruby programmer, right? A bad Ruby programmer can do a tremendous amount of damage. And incidentally, if anybody knows a good reason to override fixnum plus, let me know, because I love its dynamicity, and I've always been like, how would I override fixnum plus? What would that be good for? The only thing I could, yeah.
I found a reason.
What's that?
I want to write a computer algebra system in Ruby.
Oh, okay.
You want to do what?
Okay, let's take that offline. I'm going to ask you more about that from them. But anyway, but there are these like social dynamics that mean that some languages are just going to be easier to introduce, right? Like I think a lot of programmers and even a good number of Java programmers feel like, hey, everything's an object and you can override and stuff, and I could even add a method not even to the string class, but to the one instance of the string class. Some programmers are like, oh, that's awesome, right? And some business people, if they know enough about programming to know what you're saying, are like, are you kidding? Are you fucking kidding? We're going to let anyone do that in our own code base? So, yeah. Anyone? Yes.
I don't know if you've read much Western philosophy, but some of the later sort of philosophies of pragmatism is really kind of interesting, where a lot of Descartes sort of constructed like this is the way the world works, and then Hume came and sort of knocked him down and said we can't know anything.
Yeah.
And sort of later pragmatism came to sort of solve that problem. I think that may be compared to sort of the dynamic type languages where I don't really know what this object is, but I can sort of ask it and figure it out. Sort of in terms of perception, where like it's more of an individual perception and sort of a collective perception of what we all think the object is, rather than something that's hard and fast. And this object has to be this object.
Yeah, and I'm not very good at like kind of contemporary Western philosophy, but my understanding is that's kind of what post-structuralism is. Basically, you sort of say meaning is socially negotiated, right? Like you sort of say this thing is defined this way because we more or less that's how we use it. It's not defined this way because of anything eternal or sort of universal about it. It's just a word that we made in this room, and it's useful for the people in the room, and tomorrow we might discard it. But yeah. Other people? Anyone? Yes, you answer.
Yeah, a couple of things came up in rapid succession earlier on. One was we'll be taken in reverse order. The object-oriented programming coming from category theory. It's an interesting thing that the type object-oriented programming is an example of two things being developed independently that sort of claim the same name. Because the other version of object-oriented programming that kind of rooted itself from Alan Kay and Smalltalk was basically based not at all on category theory. It was based on biology and having objects that were sort of entities that talk to each other, right? It got confused because he did mention Simula as an influence on Smalltalk, but it was Simula, not Simula 67, which introduced the notion of classes and types, right? The other thing was the interpreted language versus the strongly typed languages. I think what happened, you have to look at it historically. I mean, part of it is the efficiency. But if you think about it, we went through a period kind of in the 70s, I guess, actually before that. We were kind of marching up this hill because we were actually using untyped languages like C. Types actually came to C rather late. And we were fighting all of these bugs because programmers had all kinds of freedom to do stuff with pointers and casting them as integers and whatnot. And that drove a bunch of techniques, okay, that would basically kill those bugs, okay? Then we got to the phase where we had personal computers and whatnot. And we had climbed this hill and we're kind of sitting in this valley here, right? And then other, the interpreted languages were there basic. Smalltalk came along, right? And at the same time, you had C++, right? And I was very involved in the C++ versus Smalltalk discussions, right? And it was always efficiency, right? The fact of the matter is, if you kind of climb up another little hill, okay, you're struggling with a couple of things. You're struggling with the performance aspects, and that gets solved over time as the hardware gets better, okay? You're also solving that you've got a new set of problems here because you're now dealing with a dynamically typed language. How do you organize that? Okay? And out of that came test-driven design, starting with SUnit. agile programming techniques, refactoring browsers, and those kind of tools. And now all of a sudden you get over the crest of the hill, and you have this kind of slide that, it kind of changes the slope because you've got this new technology, and now we have a new valley that we're in, or a lot of us are in, that's, more comfortable than this, one that was up here. So, I don't know.
Thanks for that comment. I'm past my time officially, so I'm going to close and we're all going to go to dinner. But thanks everyone for listening.